My máme dnes mimořádnou příležitost slyšet tři významné, evropsky i světově významné osobnosti, které posunuly naše poznání dopředu. A dovolte mi, abych přešel nyní do angličtiny. It's my great pleasure that President of EHA, Professor Elizabeth Libby Macintyre, has accepted our invitation. I remember, so maybe she's going to tell something, but I remember when we met and she told me, okay, so it's DHAs, it's for you, and what would you like to do? And I asked her, why do not come to Prague and say it in person to the Czech Society of Hematology? Elizabeth Macintyre is a really leading person in the diagnostic. So she's a professor of medicine, so she was born in Scotland, and currently she lives and works in Paris. And Elizabeth, it's really a great honor that you accepted our invitation, and welcome in Prague.
Thank you, Marek, and thank you all for inviting me here today. Now, Marek's only telling you part of the truth, because he did say, would you as EHA president please come and talk at the post-ASH meeting? And now, if he'd sent me that in an email, I would have politely said thank you, but no thank you, because I'm EHA president, and with all the respect I have for ASH, but luckily, he asked me during a very pleasant dinner in a mantle cell meeting in Seville in Spain, where everything was going wonderfully. And so I said, of course I can't come as EHA president. But we talked about it. And in the end, I said, great, then I'm coming. Which just goes to show that we need physical meetings, because Zooms, he wouldn't have persuaded me. Email, he wouldn't have persuaded me. But because we were in a joint meeting, thanks to mantle cell lymphoma and Europe, I'm here with the greatest of pleasure. And I honestly think it's the bit I like most about being EHA president, is to come and visit national societies, because we are incredibly lucky to share our professional interests as a way of finding common ground, from the gateway to Asia to the gateway to North America. And I consider myself very honored to be EHA president. I'm going to try and give you a talk about the evolving place of diagnostics in the management of hematological cancers. It's both an EHA and a personal perspective. As Marek said, I'm a diagnostic hematologist at Université Paris-Cité. I have been for the last 30 years, and I'm currently EHA president, but I'm also, you'll understand why for part of my talk, a small part, I'm the future president of the Biomedical Alliance in Europe, which discusses with the European Commission on transverse medical subjects. If I could have the next slide, please. So hopefully, I'd just like to give you 30 seconds to read this, because everything is encapsulated in this sentence. And what I want to try and talk about in the next 20 to 30 minutes is, in diagnostics, as diagnostics become more complex and more expensive, I think we have a responsibility to make sure that contributes to optimized costs, because we can't keep costs just going up and up and up to a level that even the richest European public health systems cannot pay for. But we do need to remember that all treatment starts with diagnosis, and of course it's an interactive process. And I think the pandemic has had a great toll across the world, but there's always a silver lining in every cloud. And since COVID doesn't respect any barriers, as does no disease, it has parachuted us into the creation of the European health space. And it's up to us to use the massive changes that are happening in European structuring of health to make sure it's in the patient's interests. Next slide, please. So you all know what's on this slide. Oh, thank you. Our cancers are 7% in adults, but 45% in children. They're mostly lymphoid, and half of them are tissue-based, so lymphoma, and half of them are liquid. Why should we classify? Because unfortunately, the human mind needs square boxes, whereas diseases are continuous spectra. And so we have to try and make smaller and smaller boxes, but then it gets more and more complex. Now, historically, diagnosis was a question of faith in your morphologist, whether they looked down the microscope at cells or tissue. You believed in them, and you did what you accepted their diagnosis. That is becoming increasingly multi-parameter. And as we increasingly have capacity for specific diagnostics, we head for more and more guidelines, whether they be from the WHO or from other bodies. We use that to understand oncogenic mechanisms and design treatment. And we also use it to provide biomarkers. Now, there are 3 categories of biomarkers, and you need to not get them mixed up. A prognostic marker predicts clinical outcome regardless of treatment. It's the survival curves we publish in our papers. If you want a predictive marker, then it predicts response to treatment at the individual level. Drug A will work for marker A, but not for B. If you want to use a surrogate marker, then you're using the marker to predict treatment effect on clinical outcome. And we use these in different ways. Ideally, the first one is for publishing and for patient advice. The second is for deciding individual treatment. And the third is for getting market authorization. And we also use it increasingly for epidemiological public health, and now health technology assessment. Having been blocked, the European Parliament has now accepted European-level health technology assessment very recently, and it's going to impact our practice. So this takes us into the era of personalized or precision medicine. They're not the same thing. Personalized medicine is using everything we know about a patient to choose appropriate treatment. Precision medicine is targeted therapy with a clearly identifiable target and its respective inhibitor, and it's essentially the BCR-Abelson model. One is obviously wide, the other much more specific. The European Hematology Association we set up what we call topics in focus. The first one was cellular therapies, immunotherapies, and we've just chosen our next topic as precision hematology. So this is a parable for what diagnostics have become. When I started hematology a long time ago, the clinician took the histology, the cytology results, didn't have immunophenotyping, barely had cytogenetics, had no DNA testing, and made the diagnosis based on what the morphologist said. Increasingly, we've added technique after technique, and for all of you that have young children, this analogy is like when you get home late after a clinic and one of your kids says, "It's my birthday tomorrow, Mum," and the school teacher says, "I have to bring a cake for the class." And you don't have time to put together the chocolate, the eggs, the flour, and the milk. So you pull one of these pre-made chocolate mixes out of the fridge and you hope that the other kids are going to think you've made it all yourself. And that's what diagnostics has become. It's become too difficult for a practicing clinical hematologist to put together all the omics data to make it into a practicable, what do I do with the patient who's sitting in front of me? And we're going to go through, I can't teach you about diagnostics across hematology, we're going to go through the mind processes that have evolved with the complexity of diagnostics. And I'm going to use DLBCL as a model. And I'm using screenshots from our totally virtual Congress in 2021. And this was Bjorn Chapuis, who gave a very nice overview, just showing the leap that I've just described from histology to flow, to profiling, to FISH, to where we are at the moment with mainly NGS, and the future will be multi-omics. So, first issue, will molecular diagnostics suffice? And then everybody comes up with different classifications. So hopefully you then agree on the different classifications and you come up with a consensus classification, or as we've just seen with the WHO, you then go for divergent classifications, and then maybe you'll come back together again after divergence. But it's all becoming a little bit complex. The pathologists say, well, we'll use omics, but we'll bring it back to what we see ourselves. So this is an example from high-grade lymphoma. Hang on, I'm going too fast. Where Herman Ott was saying, well, it'll still be our usual classifications, but we'll put transcriptional classifications in there. But then along come the data scientists, the biomedical scientists, and they say, well, let's be agnostic. Let's do multi-omics and see which comes out best. And this is just two presentations from CLL, where Wolfgang Huber showed us that when they did all the multi-omics, the ones that, the single techniques that predicted multi-omics in CLL were mainly RNA-seq and DNA methylation, or epigenetic analysis. And I think it's a fairly acceptable idea that epigenetic subgroups are more likely to be druggable than are RNA-based diagnostics. So we get to the stage where it's the data scientists that are coming up with everything. But will it all go full circle? Will we use all this omics to say we can teach the algorithms to look down the microscope and recognize the histology that fits with the multi-omics? So in the end of the day, we'll just go back to histopathology or cytology because we'll all know what it is based on what it looks like. I don't believe that will be the case, but there is data published to show that AI, artificial intelligence, is better at concordance than our pathologists amongst themselves. And you can use AI-assisted microscope learning to predict genetic subtypes. I think it's more likely that we're heading for spatial transcriptomics integrated with proteomics, functional histology, to give us novel insights. But in the end of the day, somebody has to give a diagnosis to the clinician who's going to decide on the treatment. Or will it all boil down to what are CE-IVD kits, because we're not allowed to use anything else? And I'll come back to that in a minute. What's going to be the place of functional drug testing? It's fashionable. It's some people's idea of what precision hematology is, that everybody will get functional testing, and that based on that, this is a nice study from the Finnish colleagues on AML, and that little by little we will train the databases so that they will increasingly tell us what treatment a patient needs. Now, I've talked about diagnostics. We can't not, or certainly I can't not talk about minimal residual disease because it's what I've been doing for the last 30 years. So how does omics fit in compared to looking at the response to treatment? And I'll just restrict my comments to lymphoid malignancies. So if omics describes the disease, MRD is the disease. That's why it's fundamentally useful if you decide and choose to use it appropriately. I firmly believe that oncogenetics and MRD are complementary, and I think it's easy to prove that. Historically, MRD was used for cohort description in randomized clinical trials, mainly in ALL, but increasingly in mature B lymphoid disorders. The possibilities for preemptive treatment very much depend on disease kinetics. If a patient is going to take 2 weeks from molecular conversion to relapse, it's too late. So the way you use MRD in chronic disorders is different from in acutely, rapidly evolving disorders. I think the use of surrogate markers, MRD as a surrogate marker, is a question that is being increasingly explored, but it's a complex subject, and it's taken me a bit of time to understand why something that is obviously predictive within clinical trials and at a patient individual level is perhaps not appropriate for surrogacy for a market authorization as it's currently used. That is not to mean that we will not use biomarkers as surrogates if we change the way market authorization is managed in a world that is evolving towards real-world data and post-market evaluation. Technological evolution, we've moved from gold standard quantitative PCR to next-generation flow, to droplet PCR, to NGS. And we mustn't forget, at least in lymphoma, that MRD will always have to be compared also with imaging. I'll just show you very briefly 2 slides of unpublished data that we've done in the European MCL network, which is we should always remember that technological evolution is one thing, but the bottom line is which MRD is most discriminating for prognostic and predictive markers. And this was a study where we compared classical RQ-PCR, which you can see in the middle column on the left, with NGS or droplet PCR for mantle cell lymphoma. It's a highly selected group of patients who were selected to have this gray zone positivity that is very much the hallmark of mantle cell lymphoma, when you don't really know if the result is positive or negative, and it's not much use to anybody. And as you can see here, there's much more convergence between droplet and NGS than there is with quantitative PCR. But when you look at the survival curves, what is very clear is that qPCR, you've got 3 groups of patients, and you can split them into 2 with both droplet and NGS. And when you look at discriminatory power and prognostic value, both of these novel techniques are much better than classical qPCR. Which is going to be used in the future between NGS and droplet PCR will be decided by something other than straight clinical performance. There will be all sorts of political regulatory issues, including also cost, but it won't just be a medico-scientific decision. So if I go back to the cake, who's going to bake this diagnostic cake? Is it going to be a clinical oncohematologist? I don't think that's any longer possible. Is it going to be a diagnostic oncohematologist? And is that person going to be an MD? Is it going to be a PhD? Is it going to be pharmacy in some countries? In France and in Portugal, that's an equivalent of biomedical scientist. Or is it going to be a data scientist? Or is it just going to be an algorithm and it will go full circle back to the clinical hematologist? But who's going to troubleshoot if something's wrong, if it's an affair between an algorithm and a clinical hematologist? So these are what I like to see as exciting possibilities, but they are changes that we need to accompany in the interests of patients and society. I think I'm going to skip that slide in the interest of time, but what it is about is diagnostic integration requires mixed skills. So each country has to train young people to acquire those skills. And how we use them is as much a political and a structural decision as it is a purely medico-scientific one. Should hematology laboratories, should malignant and non-malignant hematologies be the same thing? Should they be separate? Do we want, what link do we want with research laboratories? Do we want purely diagnostic laboratories and separate research labs? Do we want the people that are publishing in great journals never doing diagnostics that goes to the patients because that's in a CLIA laboratory and they're 2 completely separate labs? Do we want genetics to be separate from cellular tissue hematology? These are big issues that need to be decided at a national level, but ideally with European discussion about what we think is good for our patients. And after that, it's up to each country to say, we want to adapt. In an ideal world, we would come up with a a good sort of European consensual, this is what our patients need. And then each country would say, we're going to slightly vary it for good or less good reasons. And we're going to have to address this now as the European system moves from a directive system open to national member state interpretation towards a regulatory system. And that's what I'm going to try and address in the last few minutes. Once we've demonstrated possibility and utility, should the innovation be integrated into reimbursed healthcare? Now that touches on health technology assessment, regulatory compliance, European harmonization. Personalized hematology, what's the point of developing things if we can't afford them? And how do we make sure that we can afford them? And how do we optimize access to innovative therapies? And what role should we as hematologists play in that organization? So this is high priority for EHA. We've written lots of position papers. And now a position paper is the academic world writing in a language that politicians and regulators can understand. We've got our own journal now, so we have a forum for putting into the public domain our position papers. We've done them on diagnostics, personalized treatment, orphan medicines, innovative, fair pricing. And it's part of the things that we do at EHA that is perhaps less obvious than our annual Congress. This is big priority for the European Union. This is just a list of, there is a lot of money at the moment in diagnostics and in cancer management. There's almost so many calls that who's got the energy to run for them, because we all know it's complicated to go for European consortia. What can we do at EHA? I'll just choose one thing that we are doing at EHA, partly because I'm heavily involved in it, is the in vitro diagnostics regulatory path has evolved since the European Parliament voted in 2017 to move from a directive basis to a regulatory basis that for the first time didn't just involve CE marked industrial kits, but now also applies to a certain extent to the academic innovative diagnostic sector. And when I talk about laboratory developed tests or in-house devices, these are the tests that are not CE marked. And once we got involved in the implementing acts, this was too large for just hematology, so we teamed up within the Biomedical Alliance in Europe, and we teamed up with the European Federation of Laboratory Medicine, who deals mainly with the CE marked kits, because they're the clinical chemists. EHA took the lead on the laboratory developed tests, the innovative diagnostics, and we work very closely with human geneticists, particularly for the rare disease side. Now, what I'm talking about for diagnostics is very much similar to what has happened with the medical devices regulations, the heart valves, the hip replacements, and what will be happening with the digital health space. And I think I mention it not just because diagnostics are important for our discipline, where so much of disease presentation is in the diagnostic sphere, but also because this is the way the European Commission works, and this is the way, to put it bluntly, we are currently designing the European FDA. Europe is designing the European FDA. And if we want to prefer our European FDA to the American FDA, then we need to be involved in making sure that we like the rules that are coming out and the implementing acts. And that means getting involved. It's what I call regulatory science. This is not a person who's going to come and check that your lab is okay. That's the policeman on the block. I'm talking about the law lords in your respective countries who should be making sure our voice is heard so that our patients get the right access to diagnostics. And at EHA, we've got fairly involved in that. Partly and mainly because there was something that worried us. Now, kits are one thing, but in hematology, we do not want to lose the translational diagnostic value chain And we are particularly worried about that for one reason. And that reason is that there is one article in the law. We can't change the law, at least we don't think yet we can change the law. Article 5.5 prevents use of an in-house test if an equivalent CE-IVD is available on the market. Now that, in my mind and in EHA's mind, is a risk for monopolies, for price rises, and for loss of the innovative diagnostic sector. So we've set about working on that, but we didn't even know what proportion of tests are in-house IVDs. So we got our act together, we did a questionnaire. You can see the star for hematology right in the middle. And the bottom line is this. We got over 200 labs in 25 of the 27 member states with all the diagnostic specialties to answer. And the bottom line is 50% of tests, I'm not talking about individual results, the vast majority of your lab test results are with a CE-marked IVD kit because the industrial sector takes the high throughput diagnostics. But if you look at individual assays, 1 in 4 are in-house IVDs with a huge variability among specialties, and hematology is at about 25%. I won't bore you with the details because it's fairly arid regulatory science, but the bottom line is, by working with the Commission, we've become represented and respected stakeholders whose voice is heard. And I think it would be good if that stayed that way. So I'm going to conclude here, and then I'll take 2 minutes just to say just a bit of a plug for what EHA does. Hematology is at the forefront of integrated diagnostics. We're a respected specialty that invents a lot and that has very expensive treatments. So we're a specialty that has to be listened to, and we have very good relationships with the European Medicines Agency. Diagnostics, in my opinion, should be, oncohematology, I think, should be, but it's a personal opinion, should be distinct from non-malignant hematology labs. One is for the hospital, the other is for the discipline. We do something optimally when we do it often. I think that's accepted for therapeutics. I think it should be more accepted for diagnostics. Diagnostics will increasingly drive treatment and can contribute to optimized costs, but we need to learn how to persuade the regulators and the payers that we can contribute to optimized costs. But we should remember that it's not always a priority for the pharmaceutical industry to target innovative therapies, because at a very simplistic level, it's more in their interest to treat a lot of patients. HTA evaluation of diagnostics is reputed to be difficult, but it's in its infancy. And we probably need to find new ways of deciding who should get which innovative diagnostics. Surrogate markers I've talked about. And I think I'll probably stop on this slide just to say that I think at EHA level, we're working towards rare diagnostic networks, perhaps as a complement and extension of rare, the European rare disease networks. And I think you've understood that at least my position is that we should be working with the European Commission to make sure that we like the way the European health space develops. And I think EHA can help all of our member state societies in different ways. You all know that we have a congress in June, or I hope you all know. But we also support career development. We support education. We have the European curriculum and exam, which is increasingly popular. And we have a massively expanding advocacy activity for hematologists and hematology. And that involves getting to understand the way the European Parliament and Commission works. Here are some figures. We have 16 board members elected, and this year one of the 2 places coming up will be open only to Eastern European countries, to Eastern European candidates. We have 24 specialized working groups. We have an office of 45 hardworking people. We have approximately 500 individuals who work in our various committees, so if you want to join us, there's space for you. Over 18,000 people attend our events each year, whether it be Congress or other meetings, and we have only 5,000 members from over 100 different countries. And the little red arrow at the bottom is the number of Czech members. There are 65 of you. Let me just ask you a question. How many of you are ASH members in this room? Raise your hand if you're a member of ASH. Thank you. Raise your hand if you're a member of EHA. Wow, well done. I think, I won't say a comment on other countries, but I think it's sometimes the opposite. Just raise your raise your hand again if you're an EHA member, but you're not a young EHA member. Very good, well done. I will report that back to EHA. Here are your representatives, the list at the bottom, and Mary, I'm sorry, your name's badly spelt. I couldn't correct it at the last minute. That's who you are, that's where you come from, that's your age range. Fitting with the rest of EHA, a lot of you are young, but 40% of our EHA members are young, and we have very nice prices for younger members. But I'm delighted to see some of your hematology leaders are also members, which is great. And I think we increasingly have joint members. We have, you can see the 5 first joint members, Spain, Italy, Britain, Greece, and who's the other one? Spanish, hang on, I'm blanking. Spanish, Italians, of course. And we've got the 4 at the bottom joined this year, and there are others joining next year. What does it mean to be a joint membership? At a very basic level, it's easier to renew your registration. It's one fee for both societies. It means that we want to work together, and we're doing all we can to make sure that joint members notice the difference. You can find out more by sending one of your representatives to the National Societies meeting at the end of this month. And on that note, of course we have our Congress, but we do many other things, and I do hope that we'll see many of you in Frankfurt in June this year. And I'd just like to stop there and thank both EHA, but also my home team in Paris, France, without whom I would never have got to be elected as EHA president. And thank you very much for inviting me.
Elizabeth, thank you so much for the great talk. So I think although it's a special lecture, so maybe we have some time if there are some questions or comments, either from the scientific point of view or from the, let's say, the social or political or whatever. Professor Čermák, if you can come to the mic, so it's in the middle row.
Elizabeth, thank you very much for your great talk. It was very nice and was very interesting. I have only one question. Why do you think that the labs for malignant hematology should be different from the labs for non-malignant hematology? Because to my knowledge, there are many so-called non-malignant diseases that are potentially malignant. So I think it's not so much different.
Very good question. I could have said specialized hematology versus general hematology. And in line with what you've just said, the American Society has decided to call non-malignant hematology classical hematology. It's inarguable that there are very serious benign disorders. I think what I meant is Malignant hematology means working between cancer geneticists, hematopathologists, molecular people, cellular people. And that in itself is quite a complex landscape. I think that's very different from what makes the hospital run. That was my message.
Okay, I understand, because it's a problem we have here in our country too, because everybody cannot do everything.
Yeah.
So we must have some specialized labs, for example, at faculty hospitals, or some regional hospitals who are doing just basic hematologic investigations.
Yeah.
I agree with you.
Thank you. And we had a very interesting discussion when I went to the German Society, who has a different training model certainly from France. And the requirements for training for junior hematologists are becoming so exacting if you have to do all of the clinical training and all of the diagnostic training. And what's the best way to make sure that our young hematologists are optimally trained to do what they're going to be doing?
Sure, thank you.
Thank you. Any further question? If not, Elizabeth, thank you so much for coming. Thank you so much for a great talk.
Prostřední část slavnostní bude ve slovenštině. Každý rok na pražských hematologických dnech jsou 2 slavnostní přednášky HEŘMANSKÉHO a NEUWIRTOVA. Ústav hematologie a krevní transfuze organizuje NEUWIRTOVu na počest bývalého ředitele, pana profesora NEUWIRTA, který byl významným českým hematologem. A snažíme se každý rok na tuto přednášku pozvat někoho, kdo ji přednese za takový přínos hematologii nebo přínos medicíně. Letos byl vybrán pan docent Mistrík. Pana docenta Mistríka známe určitě všichni jako přednostu kliniky transfuziologie a hematologie na Bratislavské univerzitě jako primáře a známe ho hlavně jako člověka, který na Slovensku stál u zrodu transplantací kostní dřeně a vzniku registrů. Samozřejmě pana docenta Mistríka známe i jako člověka přátelského, který i po rozpadu Československa pěstoval stále československé vztahy a vždycky nás zval na všechny jejich akce a to bylo vždycky hrozně příjemné. On ale pěstuje nejen československé vztahy, on pěstuje jako ty středoevropské vztahy, on má dobré vztahy i s Poláky, s Chorvaty, s Rakušany a tak dále. Takže Martine, můžu tě prosím pozvat, aby si přednesl přednášku, heřmanského přednášku, která je nazvaná Vývoj transplantácií krvotvorných buněk na Slovensku. Prosím.
Ďakujem veľmi pekne. Vážené predsedníctvo, milé kolegyne, kolegovia, po takej nádhernej prednáške na európskej úrovni ja vás teda pozvem trošku do inej sféry. Je to trochu taká reminiscencia na začiatky transplantácie na Slovensku, ako sme teda rozbiehali ten program a tak ďalej. A uvidíme, jak časovo bude, ale veľký priestor na súčasnú analýzu asi nemáme. Takže skúsim teda vás pozvať do histórie, teda názov Vývoj transplantácie krvotvorných buniek na Slovensku a zároveň teda vás pozývam aj na Slovensko, ako Petra Vlhová robí. Toto je prehlásenie, moja prezentácia nezahrňuje žiaden konflikt záujmov, nebudem hovoriť o liekoch, liekových nejakých skupinách a tak ďalej. Tú prezentáciu najprv, keď ma pán profesor teda oslovil, a bola to veľká česť, ozaj si veľmi vážim, lebo českú hematológiu beriem ako staršieho brata, alebo taký vzor pre nás a viac menej, keď ma oslovil, tak som teda hovoril OK. Potom, keď som sa obul do tej témy, viac menej som zistil, že je tak obšírna, že musím načrieť do niečoho, A ja som si vybral také zhruba 4 oblasti, kde by som teda rád vás teda oboznámil. Prvé boli teda transfúzie kostnej drene, potom klinický program vlastne transplantácií na Slovensku. Národný register darcov kostnej drene je enormne dôležitý, lebo keď hovoríme o transplantácii, musíme mať darcov. Bez darcov teda autologný transplant sa dá urobiť, ale tá výzva predstavujú tú výzvu nepribuzenské alebo iné typy transplantácií. No a keď hovorím o prvých transplantáciách alebo prvých transfúziách kostnej drene, som hrdý na to, že som teda robil a pán profesor Hrubiško bol teda môj šéf a veľmi zlatý človek s úžasným rozhľadom a bol prvý podpredseda Československej hematologickej spoločnosti, ktorá vznikla v roku 52, takže bol aj teda medzinárodne a hlavne teda uznávaná osobnosť. No a takou tichou, nie veľmi vyčnievajúcou, ale enormne šikovnou, enormne múdrou bola pani asistentka Šteruska, ktorá vlastne sa narodila v Prahe a potom po vojne s rodinou teda prešla na Slovensko. Ja hovorím našťastie, ona to asi za také veľké nešťastie, respektíve za šťastie nepovažovala, ale bola teda spolu s profesorom Hrubiškom v 60. rokoch a hlavne v 60. roku už začali pripravovať a zaoberali sa odberom drene, jej stabilizáciou, transfúziou a podobne. No a vyústilo to do prvej transfúzie kostnej drene, ktorú uskutočnili v 61. roku. Uskutočnili to na Ústave pre výskum a liečbu nádorov v Bratislave. Je to taká dôležitá meta a v podstate bolo to, ale zdôrazňujem, v ére, kedy nemali k dispozícii to, čo máme my dnes, alebo posledné desiatky rokov. No a obdivuhodné bolo, že nasledujúci prenos drene v roku 62. teda transfúzia drene od teda matky svojmu synovi, chorému na akutnú leukémiu, sa podarila. Po intenzívnej chemoterapii sa haplodická dreň ujala, no vtedy sa nedávala imunosupresia, nevedelo sa, ako postupovať ďalej, takže v tom zmysle, že podarila sa v zmysle uchytenia, ale v zmysle prežitia pacient zomrel na fatálnu reakciu, ktorá sa označila ako sekundárny syndrom. Vieme teraz, že to bola akutná GVHD. Takže to boli vlastne prvé transfúzie. Oni to veľmi pekne aj nazvali, publikovali to v lekárskom obzore v 67. roku. Pokračovali v tých transfúziách a mali skúsenosti s transfúziou kostnej drene pri útlmoch dreňovej krvotvorby zhruba u 22 pacientov. Nebudem chodiť do detailov. Ja len chcem povedať, že viac menej mali teda dobré skúsenosti v zmysle podania. Tá dreň obsahuje veľa aj erytrocitov a tak ďalej, takže pomáhala aj v zmysle substitúcie erytrocitov, ale zaznamenali aj to prechodné prihojenie. No a obrovská a veľmi zaujímavá, keď budete mať času si to pozrieť, veľmi zaujímavá diskusia, ktorá nadefinovala všetky tie okruhy, ktoré teraz našťastie už máme splnené, takže budovanie registra a podobne. Takže to boli moji spolupracovníci, respektíve moji učitelia a ja som teda mal to šťastie, že som s nimi robil a v podstate pod ich vedením profesora Hrubiška sme vybudovali potom koncom 80. rokov na klinike hematológie v Bratislave aseptickú jednotku Ostrov života. V tých začiatkoch sme enormne kladli dôraz na sterilné prostredie, čo viete sami, že nie je úplne všetko rozhodujúce. No a bolo už vtedy, koncom 80. rokov, bola v dispozícii HLA typizácia, takže sme okrem aseptickej jednotky, tam sme sa museli naučiť zavádzať centrálny venózny katéter, jeho ošetrovanie, antibiotická liečba, len pre vašu ilustráciu, to boli ešte pozostatky socializmu v 89. Nie, revolúcia bola až koncom roku. Takže napríklad antibiotika ako gentamicín, amikacín, amfotericín, keď sme potrebovali, museli sme volať bol to jediný lekár určený na to na západnom Slovensku a v Bratislave, ktorý mal teda tú moc, že nám buď odsúhlasil podanie lieku, alebo neodsúhlasil. Takže to boli veľmi triskné chvíle. No ale hoci ako sme potom v máji 89 urobili prvú transplantáciu u pacienta s finálnou fázou ochorenia, s blastovou fázou CML, Samozrejme, pán profesor sa teda v rámci tej diskuzie o indikácii sa dotkol toho, že to nemá reálnu vyhliadku. Viac menej náš argument bol, že musíme si vyskúšať celú logistiku transplantácie, odber od zdravého darcu. Pacient bol motivovaný, darca chcel veľmi darovať kostnú dreň a napríklad ožarovanie sme robili teda provizornými postupmi na tých onkologických ústavoch v Bratislave. Takže vrátim sa k tomu. Prvá teda súrodenská transplantácia v tom máji 89 síce prebehla bez komplikácií, darca sa mal veľmi dobre. Bol to fotbalista, ktorý zhruba 3 dní po odbere kostnej drene hral fotbalový zápas. A keď som sa ho na kontrole pýtal, že nemáte nejaké bolesti, lebo však sme odobrali 1200 ml dreňovej krvi, teda z pánvovej kosti. A on hovorí, pán doktor, vy si neviete predstaviť, keď vo fotbalovom zápase vám niekto nabere zozadu. Toto je úplne pohádka, žiadna veľká bolesť, ale pri tom fotbale tam zažijeme bolesti veľké. Takže to bolo povzbudivé pre nás a potom sme už samozrejme rozbehli transplantačný program. Toto sú pani primárka Demečková, kolegyňa Pojtarová, ktorá je teraz hlavný odborník pre transplantácie a kolega Cako, ktorý je konzultant v Anglicku. Ale v podstate títo kolegovia zácne pomáhali a rozbehli sme teda ten transplantačný program. Dôležité bolo, že každú jednu transplantáciu sme referovali do Milwaukee, Spojených štátov amerických, do registra a teda na základe toho sme dostali aj kód, pracovisko, no a opierali sme sa ozaj vo veľkej miere o pomoc Českej republiky. Aj ja som bol na školení v Hradci Králové, kde mali ostrov života a v podstate sme sa učili tie aseptické spôsoby ošetrovania a tak ďalej. Nebudem chodiť do detailu, ale myslím, Milan Blaha ešte aj funguje tam v Hradci a Karel Indrak bol tiež veľkou oporou a celý rad kolegov, ktorí tu sedia a ďalej sme mali veľké šťastie, že bola Viedeň hodinu autom, takže keď nám chýbal liek, chýbal nám materiál a tak ďalej, sadli sme do auta a mali sme to. Bolo to vďaka tomu, že vo Viedni fungoval pán profesor Hinterberger, ktorý bol sekretár Európskej spoločnosti pre transplantácie a v podstate my sme nemali nejaký mohutný program. Uvidíte v ďalších obrázkoch, teda respektíve tam predtým som ukázal, že to boli len desiatky transplantácií. Vidíte, že desiatky ročne. Dôležité bolo dosiahnuť tú metu 10 ročne, lebo na základe toho sme mohli dostať akreditáciu Európskej skupiny pre transplantácie. Takže to bol ten rozbeh, prvé transplantácie, taká nová éra a v podstate veľmi dôležité bolo potom, že sa rozbehli autológne transplantácie, v súčasnosti Národný onkologický ústav, vtedy v tom 92. to bol onkologický ústav pre Slovensko, tam pracoval pán profesor Koza a primár Fußberger a kolektív, tí zabehli a rozbehli autológne transplantácie periférnych buniek, mali kryotechniku, mali separátor na tú dobu, čo bola fantastická vec. No a my sme v spolupráci s UHKT začali robiť v tom 92. odberi autológnej drene a dreň sa potom transplantovala do UHKT a tam sa spracovala, skladovala a v prípade, že sme potrebovali dreň, sme si ju doviezli. Takúto prvú transplantáciu s dreňou z UHKT Praha sme urobili v januári 94. Takže to bol rozbeh teda transplantácie u dospelých autológnych. No a samozrejme veľmi sme uvítali a s pánom profesorom Starým sme už aj sa dotkli toho, že sa rozbehli aj úspešne transplantácie krvotvorných buniek u detí. Ten zakladateľ programu transplantačného bol primár Lukáč a potom pokračovateľkou bola Julka Horáková a je stále. Primár Lukáč bol človek veľkého rozmeru, lebo nehambil sa pozvať, treba sme si pozreli tú vzduchotechniku, poradiť sa, nemal problém s tým, že pri prvom odbere drene som treba asistoval. Mne to pripadalo dosť také zvláštne, lebo od toho chlapčeka, kde uvidíte, vpravo je darca na obrázku, ktorý daroval teda dreň svojej sestre 8-ročnej, na tento chlapček, tam sa odoberalo do striekačky 3 ml, 5 ml drene pri tom aspiráte. U dospelého sme ťahali 20 a sa to striedalo a tak ďalej. Tam to proste tých 1000 ml nebol taký problém. Tuto bolo to niekoľko desiatok mililitrov dreňovej krvi. Tá transplantácia prebehla úspešne, vidíte teraz po 25 rokoch, to je tá dáma s 2 deťmi, aj s manželom, takže to je to, čo nás drží nad vodou pri všetkých problémoch. Ten program transplantačný u detí sa veľmi pekne rozbehol. Toto vidíte, alogénne transplantácie. Prevažovali najprv súrodenecké. Momentálne vidíte, že vlastne tie ostatné roky teda pokrývajú hlavne teda alogénnu transplantáciu. Nepríbuzenské transplantácie vďaka nášmu registru. To prežívanie detí je veľmi pekné. Budem citovať pána profesora Starého, hovorí, tie výsledky už nemôžete mať ani lepšie. Takže v podstate, no a samozrejme, súčasne sa rozbiehali transplantácie autológne na iných pracoviskách na Slovensku. Vidíte, vpravo teda Košice sú, potom Banská Bystrica, Univerzitná nemocnica Martin zatiaľ nemá ešte európsku akreditáciu. Toto je aktivita, vidíte, dominantne bratislavský centier, ale chvála Bohu sa rozbiehajú aj autológne transplantácie na iných pracoviskách a znamenalo to prudký rozvoj autológnych transplantácií a samozrejme počty aj alogénnych stúpali. Toto sú indikácie, ktoré zodpovedajú európskym indikáciám. A toto je vývoj. Keď mám hovoriť o vývoji, vidíte, že v prvých rokoch autológna transplantácia pri lymfome dominovala, potom v určitej fáze okolo roku 2005-2008 preskočili ju autológne transplantácie pri myelome, teraz to zase pokleslo. Takže to je dynamika, dynamický proces. No a pri alogénej transplantácii jednoznačne v priebehu tých rokov vidíte, že akutná myeloblastová leukémia je číslo 1 hlavnou indikáciou. No, teraz Národný register ešte musím teda sa zmieniť, lebo hovoríme o transplantácii. Tým, že sme robili najprv súrodenecké transplantácie, to vyzerá pomerne jednoducho, že OK, vnašiel sa súrodenec, ale veľmi dobre všetci viete, že vlastne len 20%, možno 25% jedincov má vhodného súrodenca. A tá väčšina tých takisto testovali a nebolo to úspešné. Takže v podstate začali rozmýšľať nad tým a založili potom v 95. Národný register dobrovoľných darcov kostnej drene, ktorý sa opieral hlavne o darcov krvi. No a potom neskôr vidíte, že od roku 2009 demolujem to tu, no? Takže potom od roku 2009 už tie počty náborovaných darcov, dobrovoľných darcov výraznejšie sa zvyšoval. Premietnem to na schvál, lebo mne to tak pripadalo, neviem, či ste počuli o tej aktivite, mne to pripadalo, dosť som sa zle cítil na to, že, ale to PR manažeri povedali, OK, to je dobré označenie, dobrý názov, máte slinu, ale v podstate ten, kto sa prihlásil, že prichádza do úvahy, že by bol darca, tak sa mu poslal taký set na odber slín. On potom poslal tie sliny, tie sa vyšetrili a v podstate máme takto navýšený počet viac jak 20 000 dobrovoľných darcov, teda v databáze. Čo je veľká práca registra, je vyhľadávanie pre pacientov. Vidíte, že vyhľadali za tie roky od 99 do 2022 a hľadali pre viac jak 1000 pacientov hodného darcu nepríbuzného v registroch. Od roku 1998 sú súčasťou, ten register je súčasťou tej celosvetovej siete. Pre dospelých hľadali pre 720 pacientov a pre deti vidíte viac jak 300 pacientov. No a ten dovoz štepov nie je až tak veľký, ale predsa len sa podarilo vidíte, z Nemecka doviezť až skoro 474 štepov, z Poľska 100, už aj zo Slovenska 48, Českej republiky 4, neviem teda, ale to povedia teda kolegyne z registra, prečo je toto fakt takýto nižší počet. No a ideme na nepríbuzenské, lebo tie sa opierajú práve o tento register. Sú to nie len transplantácie u dospelých, kde vidíte, že v 1999 sme urobili prvú transplantáciu kostnej drene. No a potom v ďalších rokoch, v 2001, rozbehla sa aj transplantácia kostnej drene od nepríbuzných darcov u detí. Toto sú už výsledky nášho pracoviska, lebo tá činnosť transplantačná nepríbuzenská, vidíte, prvých 10 rokov, to bolo za celých 10 rokov 23 transplantácií. Teraz moji kolegovia, keďže ja som teda už taký externý pracovník, tak v podstate minulý rok urobili 58 transplantácií od nepríbuzného dárcu. Takže ten nárast je enormný a klobúk dole pred ich aktivitou. Toto sú výsledky, ktoré teda pán doktor Sobko, ktorý je teda teraz primárom, v podstate mi poskytol takúto recentnú analýzu. Ja teda hrdo hovorím, že PNH je náš favorit. Kolegyňa Vojtarová je tu, ona stará sa o tých pacientov, indikovala ich na transplantáciu a vidíte, že tam nemáme žiadnu nehodu. Zatiaľ držím palce. No a samozrejme to prežívanie je závislé od diagnózy a keby sme to stratifikovali, či sú v remisii robení, alebo či v pokročilej fáze, podľa toho by sa to ešte rozdelilo. A vidíte, že je to viac jak 400 pacientov, ktorým sme dali šancu na život nepríbuzenskou transplantáciou. No a zaujímavé, ale to nie je porovnanie randomizované, teda to je porovnanie súrodeneckého súboru pacientov, ktorí sme robili súrodeneckou transplantáciou za to enormne dlhé obdobie. Vidíte, že to bolo 458 transplantácií, tá modrá krivka znázorňuje súrodeneckú, 419 nepríbuzenských transplantovaných, to je tá zelená krivka. Ja som teda pred 2 rokmi, pán profesor Cetkovský bol na tej akcii, kde som premietal a som hrdo hovoril, že tie výsledky nie sú štatisticky rozdielne. Teraz sa to už trošku ukazuje, že predsa len tie výsledky nepríbuzenskej transplantácie nie sú až také excelentné, ale nechcem to teda komentovať, lebo jeden faktor je dôležitý. My sme v prvých rokoch a hlavne pri nepríbuzenských transplantáciách robili mladých pacientov. Toto je analýza do roku 2020, z roku 2015 a vidíte veľmi pekne, jak sme si začali trúfať robiť starších pacientov na 60 rokov. Trošku bolo aj to tým, že aj ten transplantačný tím samozrejme trošku zostarol, takže v podstate na tých starších jedincov sa pozeráme ináč, ale aj tí pacienti teda sa dopočuli, že to je možné a tak ďalej, takže sa snažíme robiť teda pacientov, ktorí sú teda schopní absolvovať tú náročnú liečebnú metódu. No a teraz idem k jednému dôležitému momentu, kde sa vrátim späť tej prvej nepríbuzenskej transplantácii. Toto je Majka Kušiková, pani doktorka Kušiková je teda už v súčasnosti tiež nie je úplne aktívna, ale bola vedúcou Národného registra a v tom 99. v úzkej spolupráci s plzeňským registrom vybrali vhodného darcu. Toho pána doktora vám nemusím predstavovať, je to pán primár Koza a oni vybrali vhodného darcu. My sme potom urobili transplantáciu takéhoto fantastického štiepu, to bolo viac jak 1200 ml dreňovej krvi, v podstate enormne výdatný štiep. Toto je 17.2.99 sme urobili nepríbuzenskú transplantáciu, no a chcem teda...
Program slavnostního podvečera běžel jako obvykle, ale málo kdo v sále čekal překvapení, které mělo přijít na závěr. Po promítnutí příběhu československého vystoupil plzeňský primář doktor Vladimír Koza.
Milí přátelé, já jsem vzpomínal, že nás tento příběh k něčemu inspiroval do budoucna. Snad jste si povšimli 2 věcí. Já jsem Tomáše skutečně viděl poprvé na vlastní oči, tuším před 1,5 roku. A jistě se mnou budete souhlasit, to je krásný mladý muž. On je dokonce o kousek vyšší než já. Snad mi dovolíte, abych vám ho představil na vlastní oči. Můžete Tomáše poprosit i s maminkou?
Rodina Šustekových ani diváci v sále netušili, k čemu se schyluje. Utajit přítomnost dárce i příjemce v sále se podařilo opravdu dokonale.
A paní Šusteková, vy jste na závěr filmu vzpomenula, že byste strašně ráda, a Tomáš asi také, poznali toho, kdo byl tím darem z nebe pro vás, tím, kdo vám před 6 lety, myslím si zásadně, změnil život, vrátil syna. My to děláme všichni, nicméně onoho dárce jsme se zeptali a náš souhlas jsme měli. Pokud teď neodvoláte, já vám ho moc rád představím. Můžeme? Mezi námi je pan Jaroslav Jalora a já bych byl moc prosím.
Nastal nejkrásnější okamžik slavnostního setkání. Setkání s velkým S. Dojetí se neubránili nejen hrdinové příběhu, ale ani samotní diváci.
Takže ste videli po 5, ale je to skôr viac jak po 5, po 6 rokoch sa stretol teda darca s pacientom. Vidíte, tuto sú v objati. Ten mladý muž teda je stále aktívny. O darcovi neviem viacej, ale dúfam, že sa mu dobre darí a veľmi, veľmi pomohol pacientovi. Takže toľko na záver. Teda ten transplantačný program, hovorím, stále beží a my sme nevbehli do parkety haplo, ale nás to čaká rozširovanie tých indikácií a tak ďalej. To je už úloha mojich kolegov, spolupracovníkov. No a chcem teda sa na záver poďakovať vám za trpezlivosť, že ste počúvali túto spoveď alebo spomienku moju, taký pohľad na to, čo sa udialo. Bolo tam aj veľa veselého, aj veľa dramatického, ale rozhodne to stalo za to, každý život zachránený stojí za to. No a ďakujem Evičke Bojtarovej, kolegovi Sobkovi, primárovi, Evičke Demečkovej, ktorá zo zdravotných dôvodov už nefunguje teraz, a Braňo Cako, ten, hovorím, funguje v Anglicku, Katka Slezáková z registra a tak ďalej. Môžem menovať desiatky, ale kde chcem poďakovať aj primárke z Krakovej, ktorá tak drží ochrannú ruku nad Národným registrom aj nad celým hematologickým laboratóriom. A Mikuláš Hrubiško je teda syn pána profesora, ktorý nám teda robí kryoprocesy a nám zastrešuje túto parketu. Veľmi som povďačný Národnej transfúznej službe. Bez nich, teda bez kvalitnej substitúcie, nie je možné. Už som začul dnes, že podporná terapia je dôležitá. Samozrejme, antileukemická liečba, pokiaľ nejde v ruke s kvalitnou podpornou terapiou, je to o ničom. Takže v podstate je dôležitá podporná terapia. No a sestry, ja som veľmi rád, že sú tu zdravotné sestry aj laboratória a tak ďalej, lebo tá transplantácia aspoň na našom pracovisku sa rozvíjala vďaka tomu, že sa vytvorilo prostredie pre diskúzie, otvorené diskúzie medzi pracovníkmi z laboratória, medzi zdravotnými sestrami, lekármi a tak ďalej. A vďaka tomu sme napríklad opustili ten ostrov života pomerne skoro a teda robíme transplantácie s HEPA-filtráciou a tak ďalej. No a úplne na záver vidíte, toto je len čas pracoviska, čiže momentálne teda sme teda dobre personálne zatiaľ, dobre personálne vybavení. A toto je vľavo hore, to je Petržalské pracovisko, kde sme sa my presunuli z Podhradu teda do veľkého komplexu, kde máme k dispozícii ARO, CT, MRI, proste všetky možné základné, teda moderné oddelenia. No a veľmi úzko spolupracujeme, napríklad celotelové žiarenie. Najprv nám rozbehli v onkologickom ústave svätej Alžbety, to je vľavo dole. Momentálne využívame ale pracovisko na ožarovanie v Národnom onkologickom ústave v Bratislave v prípade, že pacient potrebuje prípravu s celotelovým ožiarením. No a detský transplantačný program som už prezentoval, ten funguje na pôde Národného ústavu detských chorôb v Bratislave. Takže to je toľko a úplne na záver nedovolí mi nespomenúť tú neľudskú situáciu, lebo celý život bojujeme o záchranu konkrétneho života. A niekto si zmyslel, že púšťa rakety a bomby na hlavy ľudí v susednej krajine, takže mne to nedá a som veľmi rád, že ste sa zozbierali na Tomáša. Gratulujem.
Martine, moc děkujeme. Dalo by se říct, tudy šla historie a ty jsi byl u toho, takže to se každému nepodaří, takže ještě jednou děkujeme moc. Tady bych ti předal diplom a tady, jak říkala paní organizátorka, mužskou kytku, taky máš.
So it's my great honor to welcome here and introduce next speaker, which is Professor Platzbecker, very distinguished person, and I have to say the one of the leading person in MDS field, and not only MDS field, but I think the whole hematology. And it's a good practice to introduce, because in the name of Professor HEŽMANSKý, this is the next lecture. So I would like to introduce Professor HEŽMANSKý to Uwe. Professor HEŽMANSKý was a distinguished hematologist in last century. He was a very good teacher, very good scientist. He was head of hematology department where I work, and Professor Traněný now is a head of this department. And mainly during his scientific work, he was an author, and he described first Heřmanského Pudlák syndrome. So this is Professor HEŽMANSKý, and now let me introduce briefly Professor Platzbecker. It's just a really brief introduction. Professor Platzbecker got his doctorate in medicine, of course, summa cum laude, at Medical Faculty of Technical University of Dresden. He did a postdoc in Fred Hutchinson Center in Seattle. Then very early he got his professorship in translation hematology at the Technical University in Dresden. And quite soon he became a head of hematology in medical clinic and polyclinic University Hospital Carl Gustav Karls at Technical University of Dresden. And now he's a director of a clinic and polyclinic of hematology and cell therapy and hemostasis, Leipzig University. And please, next slide. And all his achievement. He is a member of International MDS Foundation, a medical and scientific advisory board. He is a chairman, and I think that he established the European Medical Myelodysplastic Syndrome Cooperative Group. And you can see the map. There are many countries connected in this group, and this group did a great work in many and organizes many academic trials and conferences and so on. He's a chairman of EHA MDS Working Party. He is a coordinator of EuroBloodNet, associate editor of Leukemia, a member of editorial board JCO and Blood Advances, got many distinguished awards, and what is very important, he is a main author of many papers, even in several times in these papers like New England Journal of Medicine, Journal of Clinical Oncology, Blood, Lancet Oncology, Lancet Hematology, and Leukemia. So please, Professor Platzbecker, this is now your time. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm very humbled. I thought about recording this for my children, but I didn't. So, you know, your introduction. Before I actually get started, you see I'm well prepared, because I read the paper when I actually went on the train, and I'm very also honored that this distinguished lecture is actually dedicated to these two very famous Czech hematologists. My presentation and the title gives me, this is actually the title I always use when I want I don't know what I will talk about, and I decide a short notice, but because it leaves everything inside, standards and perspectives and 2023, so that's perfect. And I will disclose that I'm an EHA member and an ASH member. I'm sorry for this, but I am no, of course I'm just joking. I became actually an ASH member during my postdoc time in Seattle. This was a decision by heart because I felt very welcome in this country, also doing research, and then coming back to the European Union, I became immediately also an EHA member. But just now starting with MDS, and let's say the presentation is about to cover recent advances in the field of prognostication, biomarkers, but also treatment, because this is an area of research I have been involved very much in. So the EHA chairwoman already introduced a trend in hematology in her very nice presentation, and this is the so-called scoritis, we say, or scoritis. You know, there are scores everywhere for every disease, and the same is also here true for MDS. So we have multiple prognostic scores. This is just the evolution, and I'm not showing all the ones, just highlighting that the IPSS, although maybe being old-fashioned, is still valid for the purpose of using agents in MDS. So, for instance, azacitidine is approved based on the IPSS as EPO or ESA is. The IPSSR is a recent development and a major improvement, and the IPSSM got recently published based on the evolvement of molecular data. I think it's a great advance also for the prognostication. On the other side, it requires a molecular testing of certain genes at baseline, and I think it's especially important for younger patients, when I say younger, less than 70 years of age, who are transplant eligible, where I think the molecular testing gives you some hints when is the best timing maybe for this kind of patient to get transplant. This is the most widely used IPSSR, where we have low and high risk patients, and we have this kind of intermediate box, which I put into green and red, as you can see here, because the median survival is 3 years, but I think especially in these patients, the molecular testing is of high importance because it gives you some important insights. And this is true for certain mutations like SF3B1, as you can see here. A ring sideroblastic patient based on morphology is not a ring sideroblastic patient. Mutations matter, so the SF3B1 mutation differentiates the patients with the same morphology, with the same amount of bone marrow blasts, with the same blood count into high risk and low risk based on the disease evolution into AML. There was a recent WHO reclassification, and from now on you can still say MDS, but if you are in front of a patient, call it myelodysplastic neoplasm, and therefore it's MDS still. So this was the compromise, because the MPN people said don't call it MDN, then everybody will use a P and a D and nobody knows what's going on anymore, so therefore it's still called MDS, but it's myelodysplastic neoplasms. And you see that there are MDS with defining genetic abnormalities. Del5Q is well known, but also now MDS SF3B1, and this MDS with bi-allelic TP53 inactivation, which comes actually with a very dismal prognosis. And then we have morphological defined MDS, and I'm just highlighting the MDS-H, so the hypoplastic MDS. Why is that so? Because these patients preferentially respond to immunosuppressive therapy. Therefore, this term was introduced into the WHO. And then the fibrosis is also a novel subgroup, also highlighting the worst prognosis of patients with MDS and fibrosis, even in the absence of excess of blast. Then we have the ICC, and it's a lot about politics and maybe a little bit ideology and a little bit also ego and everything. It's, you know, I think there are many contributors. I think the science is free and everybody should publish and get out what he or she thinks. But I think it's with sadness a little bit that we have a standard, which is the WHO, and I think is the backbone for also reimbursement and for, especially in my country, for diagnosis. But now we have ICC as a competitor, and there are some differences now. As you know, the ICC calls MDS AML starting with 10% blast if patients have like MDS-related mutations. So I think the jury is still out, and there will be a homogenization at least in the next couple of years. I think it's a good backbone for the discussion, and it also leaves maybe an open window for future clinical trials where it's not about blasts, it's more about biomarker-driven research and approaches, and I think that's the good news, although I think many of us are potentially puzzled at this stage of development. This is just if you have an MDS patient in front of you and you know it's MDS, you know there is dysplasia, you know there is maybe 6% bone marrow blast, what to do with the genetics. Just highlighting that I think in RS positive patients, as you can see on the left side, you need SF3B1 as a demarcation for a prognosis. In 5Q, you need P53 as a demarcation also of prognosis. In patients with so-called low risk but pancytopenia, I think it's important to do for molecular testing because high risk features may evolve. And in the high risk MDS, I think P53 is an important differentiator, especially in patients with a complex karyotype. And don't forget AML defining mutations, because nowadays a patient with even 11% blasts and an NPM1 mutation is called AML and has to be treated like that. Or also CMML patients very often cover this. I now come to the question of targets and therapies. This review, as you can see, was written in 2019. Then we had the pandemic, and during the pandemic, all of these drugs I just highlight here were actually buried and burned within clinical trials. So all I want to say is that I think we have hype, which is about certain targets and drugs, but this hype is sometimes transient, and of course the phase 3 data sometimes lower our enthusiasm of early phase 1, phase 2 trials. What I will now do is guide you a little bit through the treatment, and of course many of these things are known to you, and I will not bring charcoal into Newcastle, as the British say, but of course it's repetition is the mother of learning. The Germans say that, and therefore I will also introduce to you a little bit what is known, but also what is maybe what is the future. So start with low-risk MDS, thrombocytopenia. It's very rare, single thrombocytopenia or predominant cytopenia in low-risk MDS, and we have nothing to offer. Nothing is approved, and I'm very grateful to say that within our European network, together with Anna and the Czech group, we did this a trial which we could recently publish with romiplostim as a single agent in these patients, and you see that 43% of the patients had an improvement of platelet counts. Also, there was a trilineage response in another 10 to 13% of patients, so neutrophils, and also the erythroid lineage improved. From a perspective of safety, there were no disease evolutions during treatment, a little bit of blast excess sometimes in the peripheral blood, which was transient. And also from a mutational status, this is here for SRSF2 mutated patients, the stimulation of with this growth factor did not increase the allelic burden of certain mutations. So although it's not approved, at least in my country, we use this paper now as a blueprint also to apply for insurance companies and to get romiplostim for this subset of patients. ESAs are, I think, have been used for the last 30 years. You know this threshold of EPO level of 500 or 200 according to the European label. But if you look at the response rates here, it's less than 50%. So less than 50% of patients being eligible and have a high likelihood to respond, actually respond. And the responses are sometimes transient. Median duration is 15 to 18 months. So we need something else. We need something else for patients failing or are not eligible for this. And I think luspatercept is the still very recent development in that field, a ligand trap of the TGF-beta superfamily ligands, and by doing so modulating the SMAD pathway. It all started with a phase 1 study in post-menopausal women, and then by serendipity a little bit it evolved that these women, healthy women, had also became polycythemic, and the drug then evolved into an MDS drug. You see the phase 2 was actually performed in Germany, and meanwhile we have several trials which I will introduce to you in the next couple of minutes. This was the phase 2 trial. You see a preferential response. 70% of patients with ring sideroblastic phenotype responded in this phase 2 trial, and this led to the randomized phase 3 placebo versus luspatercept in this subset of ring sideroblastic patients. 40% transfusion independence, also multiple responses occur. What was interesting is that there was no biomarker predictive of response. The majority had an SF3B1 mutation, but also many patients had other mutations. There was nothing could be correlated, and also the alleelic burden of the SF3B1 mutation also in responders remained unchanged. So at least from these data, the drug does not appear to be a disease-modifying agent. It's rather modifying what is inefficient, what is ineffective in the bone marrow as a consequence of TGF-beta superligand family members. This phase 2 trial was recently updated, and you see on the second, I think I can highlight it here, that also patients with ring sideroblast and non-ring sideroblastic patients being non-transfusion dependent, so ESA naive, non-transfusion dependent were included, and you see a 90% response rate in the RS positive patients with luspatercept. Nothing comparable has ever been achieved with ESA. Therefore, there will be another randomized trial starting the beginning of this year, head-to-head comparison in non-transfusion dependent patients with ring sideroblasts. This you can't see, so I will skip it. Sorry for this is Macintosh still. And then I think a very interesting observation from the medalist trial in ring sideroblastic patients that not only the hemoglobin levels went up, but also the neutrophil levels and the platelet. Of course, there were some thresholds to begin with, so patients were not pancytopenic, but you see that there was a clinically meaningful increase of neutrophils and also platelets as a result of luspatercept treatment. The reason for that I think is unknown, and the biology behind, just highlighting data we have published recently looking at the effect of luspatercept on stromal cells from MDS patients, and we could actually show that luspatercept, by trapping GDF11, modulates the SDF1 expression in stromal cells, and by doing so improving or can improve the differentiation of HSPCs, and we also found higher SDF1 levels in patients responding to luspatercept in the bone marrow, as a potential hint that all the other mechanisms could be involved, and also that maybe explaining this trilineage response. Comparable data were actually achieved with another activin receptor 2A trap. It's another company, it's Keros. This is just the hemoglobin response rates here. You see the drug also works like luspatercept, but it's also improving neutropenia and thrombocytopenia, so it seems to be a class effect. Again, the entire biology is not known. So taken from the medalist trial in ESA failure patients, the COMMANDS trial was designed, and the COMMANDS trial had the rationale that introducing luspatercept earlier, not after ESA failure, might be a good idea. So you see here, this is the design. ESA naive patients, transfusion dependent patients, and patients who could undergo EPO treatment were randomized 1-to-1. And the good news is that the trial is positive, and there is some actually press release from BMS, but luspatercept is superior to EPO as a first-line therapy in this subgroup of patients. There were ring sideroblastic patients and non-ring sideroblastic patients. Of course, we still need to see the entire data, but if this holds true, and I think if the data are mature enough, I think this could change our treatment paradigm as a first-line therapy in the given subset of lower-risk MDS patients. The US colleagues very often use HMAs in ESA failure patients. If you look at the true response rates to HMAs, this is a randomized French trial here, HMA versus HMA plus ESA in ESA failure, it's 16% TI rate, not very durable, heme toxicity. So I think, yes, it's something which you can do, but I think it's not something with a high likelihood and a long-term response. There are other formulations of azacitidine, like oral AZA, which also entered phase 3 programs. You see 31% response rate, and there is a subsequent phase 3 trial which is initiated now in the European Union, also run by BMS with the same question, also aiming at approval in the given indication. What are novel agents? Spliceosome modulators in SF31 mutated, SRSF2 mutated patients actually are in the clinic. These are data from a phase 1 study where only patients with an SF31 mutation responded, 20% response rate. The drug is not dead. It's still, phase 2 program is still running, and maybe it will reappear in larger programs. I think that's unclear at the moment. Imetelstat is a very interesting agent, and you see that 2009, the Nobel Prize in Medicine was given for the discovery of how chromosomes are protected by telomeres, and the enzyme telomerase was also a part of the discovery. So imetelstat inhibits the telomerase activity, which itself is upregulated in progenitor cells of MDS and AML, but also other cancers. And this is the first phase 2 trial in low-risk MDS patients failing ESA and a high transfusion burden. You see a 42% response rate with this single-agent therapy, but what is really important is a 30% TI rate of more than 1 year. So patients getting this drug, almost 30% had a TI of more than 1 year, which I think is a remarkable observation. And also from this ASH, we have seen data that imetelstat not only improves hemoglobin levels, gets into transfusion independence, but also has a disease-modifying activity. So SF31 mutation levels went down significantly. You see 56% of these patients had a more than 50% reduction. So the drug seems to maybe modify also the disease. The disease itself. You see my second chart for the night, and this is for the phase 3 program, because the phase 3 is a head-to-head comparison with placebo in a 2-to-1 randomization, high transfusion burden patients, low-risk patients, ESA failure patients, randomized. So basically, if you want, so medalist, but for all comers, not only ring sideroblast, but also non-ring sideroblast. Also, top-line results were published a couple of days ago by the company and show superiority for imetelstat. So this could be another player also in the arena of low-risk MDS. What are other activities? Coming from the thalassemia segment, PKR, pyruvate kinase activators leading to improved maturation have been successfully evaluated in thalassemia patients. There are exciting data published quite recently, and the same agents are now taken into MDS trials. Phase 2 studies are about to run. There's also a lot of hype about immunotherapies in MDS. We know that immunotherapy may work. I mean, people in the room here have pioneered these programs. Also, of course, transplant is a kind of immunotherapy. We know also that it's not only about the cellular immune system, also inflammatory signaling is elevated in MDS. Maybe the niche is involved or the niche is hijacked as a part of the hematopoietic stem progenitor cell involvement in MDS. This very complex cartoon just shows that toll-like receptors are upregulated. Also, the IRAK4 axis is activated, but also IL-1 beta, S100A9 is involved. And again, this makes this kind of pathways attractive also for interfering. And there are trials now running, for instance, with canakinumab and other agents. This smoldering inflammation is also considered to be involved into genetic instability, immune evasion, and also disease progression into higher risk MDS or AML. So maybe stopping this at a stage like, for instance, even at the stage of clonal hematopoiesis, where we also know that inflammatory markers are elevated and are also, CHIP is also linked to autoimmune diseases, I think would make it very attractive. But the question is to interfere with a CHIP patient. I think the question is what is the right patient, what's the risk of these patients to develop a potential myeloid neoplasm. So now switching gears to high-risk MDS, it's very simple. It's either ASA or allogeneic stem cell transplantation, so that's what we have. And I just highlight 2 clinical trials which were recently published for the segment of allogeneic stem cell transplantation. This is the German trial where patients up to the age of 70 years with high-risk MDS were all given 4 to 6 cycles of azacitidine, and then in case of response, the patients were transplanted if they had a matched donor. If they didn't have a matched donor, they underwent continuous azacitidine treatment, and the bottom line message is that transplant is superior to this approach of ASA followed by transplant only in case of allogeneic matched donor. A comparable prospective trial was actually published by our American colleagues. Again, donor, no donor comparison. So the bottom line message is fit patients with high-risk MDS up to the age of 70 years should get offered an allogeneic stem cell transplantation after a certain preparatory or certain bridging therapy. And the best bridging therapy, I think, is not known, just highlighting that we are doing currently a randomized trial in Germany where we compare standard of care ASA or 7+3 with compared to Vyxeos CPX351, just introducing this kind of semi-novel therapy into the bridging to transplant of high-risk MDS patients. What are other approaches? Not only thinking what can you do before transplant, but also what can you do after. I think this is at the moment high level of not only biomarker-driven investigation, but also a high level of interest by pharmaceutical companies to assess post-transplant phases. Of course, the simplest way is maintenance. You just give a drug after, like adjuvant treatment in breast cancer. You just do forever, whatever, a treatment as specific as possible. But the risk is that you over-treat a certain or high level of patients who may never relapse. This is azacitidine maintenance versus nothing. In a prospective trial, you see there's no difference in relapse and TRM, so a rather negative trial, but there are also trials now with oral azacitidine, AZA-VEN, and so on. So I think there's a lot of things ongoing. Other approaches are preemptive therapy, so you monitor MRD after transplant and you treat only the patient at risk. This is an approach we had piloted within the study Alliance Leukemia. Patients basically who responded to azacitidine as a preemptive treatment, of course, did better than the non-responders, but there was a substantial amount of patients who never became MRD positive and actually survived without any preemptive therapy. Immune-mediated therapies may work also in MDS. The question is, what's the target? We did this trial here with talakotuzumab CD123 ADCC antibody, which caused a lot of toxicity, but basically no response. There are a lot of clinical trials running with CAR T cells and with bispecific antibodies. I think the jury is still out. Also, MDS is a complicated disease, and also a surface target which differentiates blast cells or leukemic cells from healthy cells, I think is not easy. Therefore, we build a lot on conventional therapies. This is AZA-venetoclax. You see the data from a response perspective in high-risk MDS mimic what we know from elderly AML. Again, P53 mutated patients don't do as good as the others. So I think this is what resembles AML. We had to bury a drug quite recently which looked fantastic in the phase 2 study, pavonetistat plus HMA in high-risk MDS. You see a CR rate of 52% in the phase 2 randomized trial versus 27 AZA monotherapy. In the phase 3, the CR rate was actually identical. In both arms, it was 30%. So also challenging early phase 2 trials, potentially translating into approval. What about checkpoint inhibition? We know that checkpoint PD-1, PD-L1 are upregulated in patients with failing HMA-based therapy, but so far there is no positive trial with the combination or a single agent in either low-risk or high-risk MDS. Other overexpressed immunotargets for MDS and AML are, for instance, LAG3, like in P53 mutated patients. Trials are currently running because P53 seems to be a very inflammatory disease, so where maybe immunotherapy may be a very appealing approach, like for instance flotetuzumab is CD3, CD123 DART showed higher response rates in this small phase 1, phase 2 trial in P53 mutated patients. TIM3, a checkpoint overexpressed not only on T and K cells, but also on progenitor cells in the bone marrow. TIM3 antibody sabatolimab was piloted here in a phase 1, phase 2, 50 patients, response rate less than with aza-ven. And at the ASH meeting, the Stimulus 2, a randomized phase 2, was presented with basically negative results. AZA versus AZA plus sabatolimab. You see PFS better numerically, but not statistically. Also the CR rate 21 versus 17%, so no difference, but there is also a large phase 3 program ongoing and we have to see. Last but not least, CD47 is also a prognostic marker. On the right side, you see that it's up. If it's up, the prognosis of patients with normal karyotype AML is worse. So it's a don't eat me signal for macrophages. So blocking the CD47 with magrolimab seems to be advantageous. These are early data here. They have been updated actually with the same, almost the same CR rate at the last ASH meeting. There's a randomized phase 3 study ongoing currently also with combinations now I go back. It's interesting. Let's try this. Okay, and last but not least, IRAK4. I showed you the mitosome and IRAK4 is upregulated, and there are specific IRAK4 inhibitors now under investigation. One we are involved here is CA4948, which seems to be not only inhibiting IRAK4 but also FLT3, and therefore is very interesting. To summarize, this is where we are. I think there was a plethora of approval of drugs in patients with AML in the last 5 years. It's not quite the same here in MDS. I think we need more agents being available. And what we also need is a harmonization of approval and access to drugs between the European Union and our colleagues and friends in the US. What we witnessed also in the COVID pandemic is that the access, for instance, to venetoclax and other things is much faster, and I think we need to align with them also with regards to research questions. And this is the final slide. What I didn't talk about is I think the complexity of data, especially MDS, I think for a long time was such a complex disease that everybody said, well, you may do MDS, it's too complex, but and there are no drugs, but it's an interesting disease. So I think AI-based models may help to better understand the prognosis, but also maybe better understand certain biomarkers which can be targeted with novel agents. With that, thank you for having me again and happy to take questions.
So thank you very much for the wonderful presentation. And now I think I can open time for questions. If you can. Yeah, Jaroslav?
Uda, thank you very much for your wonderful review. I have one question, which is probably not too scientific, but I think it's important. And there was a lot of discussion, and you know, during the ASH meeting and other meetings about the role of morphology in current diagnosis and prognosis of MDS. And there are some voices just telling morphology is dead, we don't need it so much. And I am completely against these voices because I still think that the morphology is essential. Because IPSS and IPSS are based on morphology, and we need a morphology as a first step just to say this patient may have MDS or this patient may have some reactive changes. And all these new methods, they are fantastic, but I think they are only refining the diagnosis and the prognostic criteria for MDS and for the treatment of the patient. What's your opinion?
As always, I fully agree with you. Should I allude on it? No, of course, this was a... But I fully agree with you that morphology should not be abandoned. Fully agree. Yeah. Why is that so? Number one, I think we need it also for education of our students, of fellows. I think to see a cell, I mean, you can basically see a read of a mutation. This is also interesting, but I think to see the cell in the bone marrow of a patient, I think gives you also a kind of bondage to the disease and to the subject you study and you work in. And it's easy, it's accessible, you can do it, the smears you can do within, I wouldn't say seconds, but you know, within hours, and you get an idea what's going on with this patient. That of course the molecular technology is evolving and that we will have whole genome within 24 hours, yes, but I think it's always the question of who does it and what's the qualification and what's the quality of the analysis, and also what are the costs. I think we discussed this a couple of minutes ago, that I think access to technologies like molecular technology, I think is common in Europe, but it's not common to everybody. So there, I think until then, the morphology is very important, and I would say it as a transition phase. Maybe in 20 years we may only go for blood testing and maybe also AI-based morphology where basically final conclusion can be made, but so far I would not abandon morphology. MLL in Munich, I think they can do it because they have everything available in one spot. But I think would be a wrong signal also to the community at this stage to say morphology is no longer needed.
Thank you. So we should fight for it.
We should fight.
Thank you.
I absolutely agree, because it's a pleasure to see in the microscope the beautiful MDS. And so my question is from the other side, because you know, we have IPSS moleculars. So do you sequence all patients?
We do, because we are very curious. No, I think we do it because we are, of course, we have a biobanking and we have our registry and we have access to it, and we can also finance it or co-finance it with sometimes with grants and research grants. But in general, I would not recommend it. That's the clear message. I mean, if you have, and that's what I said, what I showed before, if you have an 85-year-old gentleman in good clinical health where you know it's a 5Q MDS, it's transfusion dependent, and 4% bone marrow blasts done by a very respected morphologist like you, then I think the information whether this patient has a P53 mutation or not, I think can be discussed with the patient. Do you want to know that? It gives us a little bit hint that the disease may accelerate in the future a little bit earlier. But I think I would not recommend it for every patient. I think the molecular testing we do for every patient below the age of 70, being also transplant eligible. Beyond that, I would not argue for a nihilism for certain molecular markers, but I think SF31, for instance, if you have ring sideroblasts, yes, you need to do. P53, if you have a complex karyotype, I would say so. Also, the WHO now wants the B allelic P53. But let's say this kind of like many office-based hematologists in Germany, you know, they just make a cross or they tick the panel of 40 genes, and then the 40 genes come back, 6 genes being mutated with an allelic burden between 2 and 20%. The question is, how do you interpret it? And is it really meaningful in the absence of drugs? And we don't have drugs. I mean, we have limited number of drugs. So I'm, of course, in favor, because I anticipate the question by the EHA president. I'm in favor of it, but I'm not. I would not use it inflationary. You know, because it also the knowledge of it of a certain to have a certain biomarker can sometimes irritate or bewilder the patient. It's the most important thing. What will the doctor translate from this message into the patient, and what does it do with the patient? Sorry for this long answer.
I agree with everything you've said. I think we should never forget that it's always the morphologist that sets the whole process off. Somebody looks down, there's a blood count, and somebody looks down the microscope and somebody says, let's start the whole process running. My question to you is, could you make a guess about what percentage of sequence of targeted NGS results lead to individual patient treatment change, either in a research structure or a unit that is heavily interested in myelodysplasia, or if you took the whole of your hemonc office practice, roughly
10%.
What percentage?
10%.
You think it would be 10%?
In MDS, it's 10%, because your question was precise. Treatment change. To what treatment should I change? You know. I mean, that's the point. So let's say 10% of all MDS are eligible for transplant. 10% because of the median age and so on. So let's say we talk about 10% of patients being already high risk. So you know you don't change the treatment because and then you have a subset of patients you don't know risk. So you do the molecular, and then they are high risk. So, and then for the others, I think even if P53 mutation is there in a del(5q) patient, I would still treat with Revlimid. The only potential interesting thing is the SF3B1 mutation, which really could give you a hint that the prognosis is very good. So luspatercept may be continued for a longer time. But in general, I think it's very much academic still, and it's very intellectual, and you can go scores, and then you can show the patient this and this, but the patient is actually not getting it in many cases. I'm not saying intellectually, but also because what does it mean? Will I die in 2 years? And then you explain what median means and range means. So, okay, so what is this information? I think it's intellectually very, very challenging at this stage, and at least in Germany, the easy access of this molecular testing, even from the blood, just a tick mark by the nurse and 10 ml of blood going to Munich, and then you get, 1 week later, you get 40 genes, which is beautiful, it's great, you know, but I think for MDS, treatment change, as you mentioned, not sure.
Very nice reply. Since I've been doing hematology for nearly 40 years now, when I was very young, I stood up at a meeting in lymphoma in the United Kingdom, and I said, I think one day we'll immunophenotype all lymphomas. And everybody burst out laughing, saying I was wasting money, and what on earth was this idea that in 1982 I would be talking about, and I was only talking about a pan B and a pan T. So maybe in 40 years' time, somebody younger than both of us will be saying, can you imagine?
Yeah. I mean, of course.
But I fully agree with all your results, your replies, and very nice to hear them.
I think it's with the electromobility and you know, and gas and diesel and this stuff. You still need both at this stage, and maybe, you know, we will not drive anymore in 20 years, but that's another story. But maybe you know, we need diesel and gas longer than we thought. So just as an indirect answer to your question, and let's see what's going to happen.
So if it is no other question, so thank you very much, and we will stay here, please, because we have.
For how long? maybe a week. I would stay a week now in Prague. This would be great. Thank you very much.